My dear friends, I'm the Reverend Dr. David William Parry and co-hosting with my dear friend Professor Emeritus of the University of South Wales, of all things, my dear friend Professor Kevin Mills, as we explore the art of liberty. The idea of the show, a highly experimental show, being to look at books, bookmen, literature, materials of a literary taint, of a literary colour, from a number of angles that have helped set people's minds and hearts and souls just a bit freer. Not a bad half an hour for a Sunday afternoon. Now, Kevin and I had the privilege, I think that's the correct word, and if the two Rachels ever watch this, hugs and kisses to the two Rachels. We had the privilege speaking at the Rite of Spring, WRITE, at the University of Glasgow a couple of weeks ago, and their rather timely need to explore what they call rebellious research and rebellious writing. That is because one of our heroes, Kevin and I share a hero in Saint Jacques Derrida, has been one of the architects of what you can honestly call an epistemological crisis in modern scholarship, in the Western understanding of what we're all doing. Not the only one, but one of the major architects of this problem. And the idea, I think, behind rebellious research, rebellious writing, is to look at ways around that problem, is to explore. For me, it's a resurging of the Romantic tradition, plain and simple. But other people see it in different ways, and whatever it is, it might be just the medicine and really helpful panacea that we all need to get back on our intellectual legs. I felt Kevin's particular contribution, Daniele Hardy Irandust was the architect of this project. As always, he comes up with such brilliant plans. There were a number, about four of us in all. I thought Kevin's contribution stood out like a sore thumb because it had an elegance and excellence to it that's quite rare in the picture kucha method. In other words, this Japanese relaxed way of doing things, like a sort of chat between friends accompanied by slides and images. Not a bad idea. But Kevin's, for me, I can't speak for anybody else, although I think most people would agree who were there on the day. It not only needed a wider exposure outside of the University of Glasgow, but was absolutely brilliant. Kevin, on that note, the floor is yours. Take us through your presentation for a second and even more wondrous time.
Okay, thanks very much, David. Lovely to be here again with you today. And as you say, I'll talk a little bit about Francis Bacon, the early modern philosopher rather than the modernist painter, as a rebellious writer. And in some ways, that's kind of counterintuitive, I suppose, because in many ways, Francis Bacon stands out as a kind of figure of the establishment, well-known philosopher, studied in universities and goodness knows what over many, many years. But he seems to me an important figure in the idea of the writer as rebel, the writer who challenges the norms and conventions of his day, their day. So if we think for a moment about Francis Bacon, so those are his dates there, 1561 to 1626. Now, in many ways, of course, Bacon is an establishment figure. He was Baron Verulam and Viscount St Albans, a member of the aristocracy. Went to Trinity College, Cambridge at the age of 12. Entered Gray's Inn, 1576. In 1584, he entered the House of Commons for the first time. He then represented a number of constituencies over his lifetime. And then in 1596, he's made Queen's Counsel. So you can't get more establishment than that, can you, really? A member of the aristocracy, educated at Cambridge, a member of the Inns of Court, an MP, and a Queen's Counsel. That's the establishment in the flesh, isn't it? In a way. But at the same time, there is a kind of rebellious spirit to Francis Bacon. There is a rebellious writer in the sense that he is challenging so much of what passes for philosophy, thought, inquiry in his day. So if we think for a moment about the way that Francis Bacon wrote, he challenged the conventions of English prose in his day, at a time, of course, when English prose is still developing. You know, the spelling isn't fixed, the grammar isn't fixed, and these things are still up for grabs. And what Bacon does is to look at the writing of his day and come to the conclusion that it's too flowery, too wordy, too ornamented, and therefore it's very difficult to communicate anything with any clarity in the language of the time. So he aims to produce a new kind of writing which reduces ambiguity, which makes language the servant of knowledge rather than the servant of aesthetics. So it's writing that isn't seeking to draw attention to itself, but trying to open a window onto the world beyond. And that's a deliberate rejection of the writing of his time, the Ciceronian mode, you might say, of many of his contemporaries. People, for example, like Richard Hooker, the author of The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, and many others. So this is a short quotation from his Novum Organum from 1620. The high and formal discussions of learned men end oftentimes in disputes about words and names, with which, according to the use and wisdom of the mathematicians, it would be more prudent to begin, and so by means of definitions reduce them to order. And that's a really interesting notion to me, because in academic writing, you would kind of take that for granted, that you have to begin with defining your terms. That's where you start. Bacon is suggesting that that's not what happened, but that it should be the standard for argument, so that we begin by defining our terms, pinning down the framework of meaning before we proceed. And it's interesting, I think, that he picks on mathematics as his model here. The model for language use, Bacon says, should be mathematical precision. We should try to use language in the way that mathematicians would use it, freeing the mind from distractions, helping us to focus on the key issue. And that led Bacon to write in a very pared down style, a style which uses very little ornamentation. And if you compare, say, what Bacon writes with the way somebody like John Lilly writes, John Lilly's prose is full of metaphors and parables and classical allusions. If you read Bacon's prose, by comparison, it reads much more like a modern text. And the reason for that is, of course, is that modern texts were shaped in part by what Bacon does with the language. So Bacon is writing in the interests of a kind of ideal, of a consciousness liberated from the shackles of what he calls, in the advancement of learning, the idols of the mind. The idols of the mind. These are aspects of thought and perception which constrain our thought, which deceive us into thinking we've arrived at the truth when we really haven't. What we are seeing is illusions. So there are basically four idols, I suppose you could say. There's kind of a reductive account of them, I would admit, but helpful, I think, perhaps in getting to the nub of what Francis Bacon is arguing. The first of those idols is the idea that human senses are reliable. Now, you have to remember that when Bacon is writing, there's no perception at the time that, the human eye is an evolved organ that might be liable to error. So there is a kind of underlying belief, I guess, that human senses are reliable. Bacon says, well, they're not. The mind, he says, hastily and without choice imbibes and treasures up the first notices of things. So first impressions somewhat determine the way we perceive the world. And once we have perceived something, then it's very difficult to shake that initial response, that initial understanding. So he says the human senses are actually not reliable. The second idol is the idea that individual perceptions are reliable. The human understanding, he says, when it has once adopted an opinion, either as being the received opinion or as being agreeable to itself, draws all things else to support and agree with it. So in other words, he's getting that tendency of the human mind to ratify its own beliefs, to be confirmed in its beliefs, and to interpret the world in ways which support its fundamental beliefs. Rather than allowing our beliefs to be challenged, we tend to look for things that confirm those beliefs. And very often those are individual perceptions. They're not perceptions that you could test in a laboratory. They are purely what we would call subjective, I suppose, ways of understanding the world. And I think that if Bacon were alive today and on Facebook, he would be confirmed in this opinion, that we tend to look for things that support our own opinion. And of course, we are now supported in algorithms, aren't we, by algorithms that just confirm what we already believe, rather than exposing us to any kind of rational, evidential challenge to what we believe. The third idol is the idea that truth emerges from discussion and exchange. And this is a hard one to dislodge, I think, for lots of reasons. So there's a belief, I suppose, that Bacon is challenging, that, if you talk things through, if you discuss things in detail, you'll sooner or later, you'll get to the truth of the matter. That by entering into debate or discussion, we can arrive at the truth. And Bacon says that, well, that's an illusion, because he says words are imposed according to the apprehension of the vulgar, and therefore the ill and unfit choice of words wonderfully obstructs the understanding. So in other words, if a group of people are discussing some kind of belief or some kind of perception, there's no guarantee that they're going to come to any idea of truth, because, of course, they may all be ignorant of key facts. If I sit down with a group of my friends and discuss quantum physics, we are never going to come to the truth about quantum physics, because we know absolutely nothing about quantum physics. And I think that's kind of Bacon's point. We get the illusion of coming to clarity through discussion, but it depends who you're talking to and how much they know, really. And the ill and unfit choice of words obstructs our understanding, unless unless our understanding is based on empirical observation. The final idol is the idea of the schools of thought. Traditional schools of thought have led us to the truth, and I think Bacon is thinking particularly here of Plato and Aristotle, and the way in which philosophy really and all approaches to knowledge, the knowledge of the natural world, had really been a matter of revising Aristotle. There's a kind of presumption that Aristotle had said everything there was to say in the physics, and you would just refine that. You get better understanding of Aristotle, would give you a closer apprehension of the truth. Bacon's point is that that's, again, an illusion. All the received systems, he says, are but so many stage plays representing worlds of their own creation after an unreal and scenic fashion. So That's quite a hard-hitting thing, I think, to say in Bacon's time, that philosophy hasn't led us to the truth, and basically it hasn't led us to the truth because it isn't really based on reliable information, the kind of reliable information we get by observation, by observing the world, and by empirical means. So, actually, in some ways, one might say that Bacon is a bit of a rebel. In as much as he is refusing to accept not only the standards of writing of his time, the standards of prose, but also philosophical standards and the standards of the whole approach to knowledge. He thinks is wrong, and we've got this profoundly wrong. He says we need to rethink the very process by which we come to know things. How we produce knowledge needs to be rethought from the ground up. And we need to begin again from the basis of empirical observation of the world, and we should base our understanding of the world on observation. But particularly interested in the way this works in The Wisdom of the Ancients, which is a book dating from 1609. And I'm interested in that because I'm interested in myth, really, and I'm very intrigued by what Bacon does with mythology in The Wisdom of the Ancients. So, The Wisdom of the Ancients retells 31 classical myths, or 31 stories from classical mythology, and explains that as far as he's concerned, they encode ancient understandings of art, philosophy, politics, religion, science. So they're not just fanciful tales. They're not just things to be told around a campfire on a winter night. These are ways, they are actually kind of encodings of reality based on observation, based on the way people understood the world around them. So, in other words, there is kind of what we might see as the kind of forerunner of empirical science going on in myths. They're based on real experience, real observation, but encoded in a way that is unfamiliar to us. And if we can unpick that code, if we can work out how these stories work, then they will help us to understand the world a bit better. So he says in Wisdom of the Ancients, the concealed and secret learning of the ancients seems separated from the history and knowledge of the following ages by a veil or partition wall of fables. Now, when he uses the word fables, he means what we would call myths. So the idea that in the past, people knew stuff. There was learning that went on in the past, but we don't have access to it now because there's a veil between us and that learning, and the veil is mythology. So in other words, what we need to do is learn to read that veil. And if we can read that veil, we will have access to this ancient knowledge, this lost knowledge. So myths form a veil, which, as it turns out, Bacon thinks he has learned to read, and he conducts that reading in the interests of the new method, new scientific method. And of course, Bacon, one of the people that we think of as actually being responsible for the formulation of scientific method, one of the founding figures of the scientific method. So this is Christopher Crosby. I like this quotation because it sums up quite neatly what I think Bacon is doing. Bacon, he says, differentiates between the prescriptive and the descriptive fable, between that is myth as predetermined explanations of natural phenomena, and those which illustrate, often in engaging ways, a genuine knowledge of the natural world first gleaned by empirical means. There you have it in a nutshell. Nicely put. So myth really is a way of representing empirical knowledge. It's just that we haven't fully understood that methodology. But I would also suggest that Bacon is kind of being rebellious in a slightly different way here too, in that he is aware that reading myths in this way, treating myths as what he calls concealed and secret learning, is no less a matter of biblical than of classical texts. And that's a really interesting inference, isn't it? That's a daring inference, it seems to me. Religion, he says, delights in such shadows and disguises. And so his method, of course, is to remove those masks to find the scientific truth. And once you start doing that, once you start picking at classical mythology, how long is it before you start picking at the Bible as well and start saying, well, actually, the Bible too encodes empirical knowledge? That's an interesting way of thinking about the Bible, and a way in which, of course, people hadn't really thought about the Bible before Bacon's time. So neatly and without spelling it out, Bacon has co-opted biblical religion to the cause of the scientific method. And it couldn't do that explicitly or expressly, really. It has to do it in that slightly roundabout way. So in the Wisdom of the Ancients, he proceeds to read a selection of the classical myths as allegories of empirical inquiry and empirical knowledge. And because of the way the text works and the occasional allusions to the Bible, the reader is left to wonder, what similar secrets might Scripture hold? Might Scripture not, like the classical myths, be telling us something about the world, gleaned from a kind of scientific, proto-scientific method, rather than just by revelation? So throughout the book, throughout the Wisdom of the Ancients, Bacon alludes to the Bible and or Christian teaching and relates it to aspects of classical mythology. So, for example, at one point he offers us a reading of the myth of Proteus, and he reads the myth of Proteus as a parable of the mutability of matter. And as he's doing that, as he's going through this account of Proteus, he calls upon sacred history, that's the Bible, of course, to testify that pre-existent matter was shaped by the efficacy of the divine command. So, in other words, what led the writers of the Bible to talk about the creator as someone who could mold reality, who could, exploit the plasticity of matter? Isn't that in some way based on empirical observation of the way the world works, the way it appears? Interestingly, I think that scholars, certainly the ones that I've read anyway, tend to see the Wisdom of the Ancients as inconsistent with Bacon's commitment to plain expression, unvarnished, kind of scientific prose. But as Crosby points out, he understood myth itself to be protean. Myth was shifting, changeable, and its meanings could change over time. And I think that his brilliant perception was that this new empirical approach to knowledge could actually be read back through myth. And that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? I think to me it does. That we didn't just start observing the world, with the rise of scientific method. We had always done that, hadn't we? We'd always looked at the world around us, tried to understand it, tried to make sense of it. And of course, that's what myth does. It tries to make sense of the world as we see and as we sense it. And so it's a brilliant perception, I think, which transformed our approach to mythology as well as to knowledge. And of course, he draws in sacred history into that process. So he not only aligns the scientific method with Renaissance humanism, that resurgence of interest in the classical world, but also with Christian tradition. And of course, tacitly, he is issuing a challenge to both, and the way that both of those have been understood hitherto, and in the process founded a literary tradition of using myth to critique ideology, and that is still with us. People are still writing novels, particularly, aren't they, which use mythology as a way of thinking about contemporary values, contemporary society. Think of Pat Barker's novels, or Margaret Atwood's novels, and the way that they challenge contemporary culture, contemporary beliefs, and ideas. That all, I think, is traceable to Bacon and to his will to reconsider myth, and to suggest that myth has something to tell us about the world as we know it. Okay, there we are. Do you have any reflections, David?
Well, first of all, let me say once again, a masterful exposition of the materials. A huge round of applause. Maybe a few things just briefly. I mean, I certainly, when I put on Paul Wilson's play Drama di Shakespeare Tonight, we took it to the Edinburgh Festival. Francis Bacon was one of the characters, and I turned him into this sort of suave, sophisticate, because why not? That's stuck with me for all those years. The mutability of Bacon as a character. And it brought to mind as you were speaking, I have this huge admiration for Isaac Asimov. In fact, some of the great atheists I admire hugely without undermining my position. Because they've got so much to say. They've got so much to say. And his attempt to rewrite the Bible from a naturalistic perspective, I thought was heroic. I didn't personally feel challenged. I thought it was heroic, and more power to his elbow, and that needs to be done a lot more. Exploring the materials. There's only one thing I suppose I want to draw you out on, because it's of interest to me personally, and maybe some of the people watching us. I mean, I'm an admirer of Oswald Spengler, who is sometimes put in the traditionalists' camp. I mean, it's very clear he doesn't need to be, but sometimes put in that camp. And, the fact that people like him are holding up tradition as this sort of, I don't know, beyond reproach and beyond question, substance of knowledge. I mean, what do you think of what do you think of the so-called traditionalists in modern terms and the works they're sort of surrounded by? I mean, what's your take on that?
I don't know Spengler other than as a name, really.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've come across people for whom tradition is kind of sacrosanct, I suppose. And I would struggle with that a bit, I think, because I don't buy into the idea that all tradition, we should reject tradition wholeheartly and to core, but because there are many traditions which are important, useful, and are traditions, for a reason. But I think we don't get anywhere if we simply accept tradition as it is and don't reread it or reconsider it. I think you have to do that only whether that's literary tradition or philosophical tradition. I think that Bacon's right that we need to look at the way in which things have been done in the past and evaluate them, be critical about them, and not reject them, not accept them, but think about them, sift them, find out what's good and what's not, what's alive and what's dead, I suppose, one might say.
Well, my friend, that time is against us as always.
Oh, it's gone already then.
Yeah, if you're one of the people following this show, I know that we're a week late. The fault is mine. We had guests visiting us last weekend. I profusely apologise to Kevin and everyone else. But we're back on schedule, I hope, from next month, the first Sunday of every month. Kevin, thank you once again for this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful reflection. And my friends, anyone interested in this show, listen to what we've got to say, throw some comments in my direction, and we'll evolve together as we go along. Great peace and love to you all.